Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. This is our discussion that we'll have for Activist Appreciation Month, which is the time of year that we honor your activism with special programs to support you emotionally and also spiritually. And today, we are very fortunate to have a special guest speaker, and I'd like to first introduce everyone who's here with us today, and then we'll introduce our special guest. So, as I mentioned, I'm Lisa Levinson, Campaigns Director for In Defense of Animals, and I'd like to introduce Mary Easonsey, who's part of our development team.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Mary. And now, very honored to introduce Jay O'Shea. She is a professor, an activist, an author, and we're really thrilled that she is here with us today to present on strategies for animal activists. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here. As Lisa said, I'm Jay O'Shea. I am a professor at UCLA. I research and write about the role of physicality and emotion in social justice efforts, but that hasn't always been my research area. I actually started out as a dance historian, specifically writing about the cultural history of South India through the example of a classical dance form. And those two research histories will come together in the talk that I'm about to offer to you. So, as Lisa says, I'm going to push some buttons and we'll get started. So, I'm offering this talk to you with an awareness that many of you are full-time activists, and I'm a researcher and a writer with an interest in animal advocacy and veganism. So you probably have a better sense than I do of what it's like on the ground. I'm offering some thoughts, some theories, and some historical reflections as a way of hopefully inspiring future action. And my thinking here is intended towards creative thought around movement building. So this is a quote from famed Indian nationalist and the progenitor of the nonviolent civil disobedience movement, Mohandas Gandhi, regarding the paradox that humble homespun cloth was more expensive in India in the early 20th century than factory-made garments were. Since most of you are vegan and animal rights activists, you probably already know the comparison that I'm drawing. The ways in which veganism is often represented as expensive, cumbersome, and sometimes even as elitist. And we're going to come back to this comparison in a moment. But let's begin with the problem. The mainstream environmental movement has finally come to recognize the negative ecological impacts of meat and dairy production. And they also recognize, again, finally, that our path towards environmental destruction could actually be averted if humanity shifted towards plant-based food production. And yet, nearly every time this consideration comes up, say, for example, in media representations, it encounters a rejoinder like Jay Michelson's comment that individual behavior change isn't action, it's distraction. Or perhaps more kindly, as Naomi Klein put it, we need systems change, not earnest urbanites doing everything they can to shrink their carbon footprint. So systems change is certainly important, but there's a problem with the problem. It's rooted in a series of assumptions that are kind of peculiar. One is that changing the food system can only happen through individual dietary change, and that veganism can only operate as individual voluntary action. That individual action is not scalable, and therefore that voluntary action is just virtue signaling, that it doesn't have a material impact of any kind. Therefore, that veganism is not systemic, it's not a systemic intervention. And on top of that, the behavior change and system change are at odds rather than working together. So there is some truth within this critique of individual action. So, as many of you are aware, historically, animal rights has focused on person-to-person influence. Often it's been rooted in an attempt to get people around us to go vegan. And as also many of us know, influencing those immediately around us is slow. And often those closest to us are often the hardest to change. In addition, the historical antecedents to the modern animal rights movement have tended to focus on individual ethics and often on spirituality. So the ahimsa tradition of the Dharma practices of Asia, the Greek Pythagorean traditions, even Victorian animal rights advocacy, it's very much focused on individuality, sometimes spirituality, sometimes mental clarity. Sometimes the effort to convert people in this one person to the next kind of process can look like religion, or it can look like some other kind of in-group. And then also in a capitalist society, consumption is where people exercise their agency. And that's where we get this idea of it's my choice. And therefore, because it's my choice, it's exempt from critique. But the problem within the problem is that if we reject behavior change as a tool for justice and liberation, if we accept the idea that voluntary actions can have a systemic effect, then it ends up putting us back in the position where we rely on the exact same people who created the problem, particularly corporations and the governments that enable them. So we're relying on the creators of the problem to fix the problem. It fosters the dangerous illusion that we need to wait until someone else steps in. And as we all know, we're running out of time in which to wait. The other problem within the problem is that dismantling animal oppression, far from being a minor tweak on the food system, would be just about the largest systemic change in the food system that we could imagine. Now, fortunately, there is a rebuttal to this claim that individual action or voluntary action is distraction. And that rebuttal is, as Sailesh Rao points out, the Indian nationalist movement, and particularly the practice of wearing khadi or homespun cloth. So to paraphrase Dr. Rao, anyone who thinks it's impossible to get large numbers of people to take voluntary action in a concerted way has not thought enough about what Gandhi achieved through the khadi movement. So, what I'd like us to explore today are some key questions. So, how specifically the khadi movement used behavior change to support not just a mass movement, but one that was powerful enough to challenge the entire British Empire. And what does this tell us about movement building? What do these components of the khadi movement tell us about movement building? And then what can the movement for earth and animal liberation learn from social justice movement building from the example of the khadi movement? So we might want to think about this in terms of some big goals. Thinking about movement building and shifting the perception of veganism from an individual lifestyle or an ethical choice to an acknowledged, overtly acknowledged boycott of an unjust system. We can also move towards thinking about veganism as a tool for building a new, more just and less damaging food system. And we can focus on veganism as part of a larger social justice movement focused on systemic change, on social, cultural, economic, and political change. Of course, in putting this forward, I'm not claiming that these are unique ideas. It's something that a lot of us are thinking about right now. But I think it's helpful to lay them out like that. In other words, another way of thinking about this is, as scientist Rachel Mason puts it, is how do we put pressure on the animal exploitation system at multiple points all at once? And I think the khadi movement, as part of the larger Indian independence struggle, might give us a model for thinking about that. Now, just to be absolutely clear, I'm not comparing imperialism and animal exploitation. I'm not saying that Indian nationalism and the movement for earth and animal freedom are the same, or that colonized people and non-human animals are the same. The point is to look at this movement structurally and to try to figure out how its tactics can be generalized for the benefit of other movements. So, behavior change in the Indian independence struggle through the example of khadi, or homespun coarse cotton. Okay, so it might be useful to start by explaining or thinking through what exactly khadi is. So khadi is homespun, hand-woven cotton. It was very coarse initially. Initially, it was only available in neutral colors, that is in the early 20th century. It was turned into very simple attire of the kind that you can see here on the slide. And it was important to the Indian nationalist movement because the British, this is like the classic model of economic colonialism, they were taking cotton from their colonies, bringing it to the mills of Manchester, turning it into fine, desirable clothing, and then they were selling it in the colonies, notably in India, and selling it, of course, at a profit, extracting a profit from the colonies, which is what enabled the empire to continue. So Gandhi and the other Indian nationalists came up with the rather brilliant idea of, well, what if we just cut off the demand for factory spun cloth? They did this through a movement to encourage individual people to adopt the wearing of khadi. And it came to actually function as a kind of uniform of Indian nationalism. Part of this also included encouraging people to learn how to make cotton cloth themselves, learning how to hand loom the cotton, so that there could be a kind of complete economic independence, at least when it came to clothing. So overall, boycott was a central tactic of the Indian independence movement. And part of that was the economic aspect of the boycott, but part of it was the physical, the visual, and the emotional impact of khadi, of seeing people wearing khadi, large numbers of people showing up for marches, for protests, wearing khadi, that the people who chose to wear khadi saw other people wearing it and knew that they were in solidarity with them. So, recognizing that the movement for earth and animal liberation and the Indian independence movement are different in many ways, it might be worth noting that they do also have a lot in common. First of all, the scale of what we're up against is similar. We tend to think now of colonialism as cultural, and we tend to think of it as almost metaphorical. But it's really important to remember that colonialism was at its heart an economic enterprise. And so what Indian nationalists were countering was multinational corporate power. The British East India Company was one of the original multinational corporations. And before English colonialism in Britain was governmental, it was economic. There was also a sense of inevitability. Colonialism positioned itself as eternal. That idea of the sun never sets on the British Empire was both literal, but the idea was that the British Empire would endure forever. And likewise, animal exploitation is seen as inevitable. It's just the way things are. The movement for earth and animal liberation and the Indian independence movement are also both based around voluntary action, around an individual decision that aligns a person with a particular political perspective. Both are rooted in a rejection of specific commodities. And to go back to the Gandhi quote, khadi was considered to be expensive. Initially, it was actually more expensive than factory-made cloth because it wasn't made at volume. So there was not an economy of scale. So even though it was coarser cloth and it was humble and it was in these neutral colors, and there was this sense that it was only people of a certain status who could afford to actually give something up. The khadi movement did actually draw people from different communities, different religions, different castes, different socioeconomic classes. But it was still positioned as elite. Again, this might sound somewhat familiar to those of us in the animal rights movement. And both of them, importantly, are based in intentional sacrifice, on intentionally giving something up. Now, I think with the distance of time and space, it's really easy to look at that and say, oh, well, it's just clothing. Like, how big of a sacrifice could it be? But let's just pause and think about that for a second, because clothing, like food, is linked to self-expression and community identity. People exchange their labor and their time for money, which gives them the right to choose what to eat and what to wear. In addition, just to call your attention to some of these images, the sepia images on the one side of the screen, on the left side, give you a sense for what Indian attire looked like in the late 19th and early 20th century, like this fine brocaded, for elite people, they were wearing fine brocaded silk that was in vibrant colors and had often like gold inlay. Or they were wearing very beautifully tailored, very sleek Western clothes, particularly for men. And then if you look at the images on the right with people wearing these neutral colors, just white, beige, gray, in these loose fabrics with no brocade, not much detailing on them, I think that might give a better sense for how much of a sacrifice it was to say to people, don't exercise your choice in wearing these beautiful, brightly colored bits of attire, and instead adopt something where we're all going to look the same. So khadi, it's easy to think of it now as how big of a sacrifice could it be, but it really did involve giving up something pretty substantial. But here are some other differences that I think are a little bit more important for, or here are some differences that I think are important for how we think about the animal advocacy movement. So one thing is that the focus of the khadi movement was explicitly economic. It was about bringing the cotton mills of Manchester to a halt. And it was also about bringing economic self-empowerment to marginalized communities. It's far less common to hear veganism described as a boycott, although we are hearing a little bit more of that language now. And it's not often made overt that this is an economic intervention. This is an attempt to influence market signals. We also hear less about veganism as economic self-empowerment, as a way of empowering marginalized communities. The khadi movement had very clear, specific political aims, which was to get the British to relinquish control of India and to turn it over to Indian people for democratic self-governance. The Swadeshi movement, the Indian independence movement, was run by those affected. And here's a difference that we can't get around. The movement for earth and animal liberation is a movement run by allies. There's no way of getting around that. The animals can't advocate for themselves, although they're not voiceless, as they're sometimes described, and they're not also able to organize politically. And that, in our modern way of thinking about political organizing, is considered a drawback or a weakness. The khadi movement was also part of a larger movement for Indian independence. This was definitely complicated in a multicultural, polyglot, religiously diverse country such as India, but attachment to the idea of homeland community has a longer timeline than nationalism. But here are some differences where perhaps we can see that we're ahead of the game in comparison to the khadi movement. Now in India, khadi moves in and out of trends. You can actually go to nice stores and get beautiful, bright colored khadi, and the cloth is far less coarse than it used to be. It's now the uniform of a lot of politicians, but in the early 20th century, it was very rudimentary. And it was also something that was at the time considered to be a dying art. So people actually had to relearn how to spin cotton cloth. Whereas when it comes to vegan food and other vegan goods, we already have a wide array of taste and texture and flavor sensations, from the simple taste of produce to well-spiced legume and grain mixtures to tofu, tempeh, jackfruit, seitan to meat analogs. In addition, far from plant-based cuisine being a dying art, it's alive and well. We know that historically most societies, at least those in temperate climates, have been plant-based, and most of them have retained those traditions, even as meat consumption has accelerated in some of the middle-income countries with rising middle classes like India and China. So one way in which that we're in line with the khadi movement already is that there is a wealth of plant-based traditions that we can draw from. And we can do this not to celebrate tradition for its own sake, but to signal that there are other models, other ways of existing in relation to animals and the environment than what we see in the global north, where animal exploitation is normalized and the reduction of animals to commodities is central to the economy. So it's important to look to traditional practices, again, not to say that anything that was done in the past is inherently good, but just to remind us that we don't have to build everything from scratch. So here are some lessons I think that the movement for earth and animal liberation can learn from the Swadeshi movement. First of all, the Swadeshi movement didn't underestimate what it was up against. It expected pushback. And I think this is important to think about in relation to veganism, because for many of us, the harm to animals is so obvious that when you see it, maybe I shouldn't say you, this is how I felt when I woke up to the harm that was happening to animals. So I felt like everyone should be able to see it as soon as it's pointed out to them. All you have to do is point it out to them and they'll change. But it's a paradox because you only see it once you see it. And the harm to animals is intentionally hidden from us. I think many of us in the vegan movement assume success. And at the same time, and it's somewhat contradictory, we're also ready to see failure everywhere. Like there have been some very interesting analyses suggesting that animal rights activists are actually undercounting the number of vegans. Another thing that the Swadeshi movement did that I think we can learn from is that they accepted fellow travelers and imperfect adherents. For example, there's a quote from Gandhi on the poor who can't afford khadi, but are still aligned with the movement. And here, that doesn't mean I'm not suggesting that we should welcome those who are unapologetically consume animals when they have other options, but it can mean perhaps accepting those who are moving in the right direction, welcoming those who are struggling, perhaps for economic or other reasons. In addition, the political and institutional demands of khadi were explicit, and admittedly, they were much more straightforward than what we're trying to achieve. But nonetheless, they were institutional demands that were put forward. The khadi movement accepted and celebrated simplicity. And so to go back to that quote, the real value of khadi is the revolution of one's tastes. So like khadi, as we know, eating plants appears to be expensive because an entire political and economic system has been built on making more resource-intensive food artificially cheap. So namely, the subsidy system makes animal products artificially cheap. So the revolution of one's taste is a shift towards something simpler. And I think we could learn from the khadi movement that celebrating plant-forward cuisines is recognizing that there's a model beyond Western consumerism. The khadi movement also built community intentionally. Khadi activists didn't assume that community would arise organically, or that you could just ask people to wear khadi and expect they would do it without support. And this, I think, is very useful in relation to veganism because, as we know, there's high rates of recidivism when people try to go vegan, and a lot of it has to do with them feeling socially isolated. This also fits with contemporary understandings of how change works, particularly a social psychologist named Damon Santola, who has analyzed how complex change happens. He describes the phenomenon as requiring wide bridges, that is to say, communities reinforcing each other rather than long networks. So simple ideas can travel across long networks from point to point, but complex ideas need to be reinforced by a community. The khadi movement was also focused on how as much as why. So it involved teaching people how to create homespun cloth. It involved intentional economic self-empowerment. And this, I think, is really important for us to think about as well, because all too often animal rights and human rights are positioned as if they're in opposition. And we know that that's not true, because we know that the same systems that exploit animals are exploiting humans, are doing horrible things to humans by forcing them to work in slaughterhouses for low pay, by dumping waste on frontline communities, by allowing fast food companies to take over underserved communities. But I think it would stand us in good stead to really emphasize all the ways in which advocating for human liberation and advocating for animal liberation can come together. Conversely, animal rights is often not included in solidarity efforts, like in calls for economic reform. And then finally, the khadi movement was very much focused on reaching out to the marginal and the excluded, creating opportunities for self-empowerment among the very most exploited in society. And that was quite literal. The khadi movement, one of the many initiatives put forward was to offer employment to, say, for example, exploited undercast people, impoverished widows, poor people in the villages. And it was focused on a sort of self-empowerment, an economic self-empowerment model. So these kinds of things are already happening, of course. So putting forward economic, political, and institutional demands, things like focusing on the Farm Bill, focusing on changing the subsidy system, particularly in the United States, changing the lobbying system, focusing on institutional demands. School boards, we could approach school boards to ask for veg options, ask for green Mondays and Fridays, movements to get milk out of schools. Colleges and universities, we could be asking them to shift their dining hall practices, their catering practices. We could be looking to corporate menus, hospital menus, scaling up from what New York City has done. So examples of initiatives that already take this into consideration and make institutional demands explicit, things like Greener by Default, the Agriculture Fairness Alliance, Friends of the Earth, plant-based school meals. Another arena in which we can learn from the Swadeshi movement is to think about what forms economic self-empowerment and mutual aid might look like in a vegan vein. So we already know of organizations that are doing vegan food justice. This is completely crucial. And yet I want to suggest that maybe we could benefit from developing forms of economic self-empowerment that move beyond short-term aid, as generous as short-term aid is. So for example, programs to help transition people out of animal farm ownership, right? Things like the Transformation Project from Mercy for Animals, but also perhaps initiatives to help people transition out of working in slaughterhouses, out of working in CAFOs. There are very few people who that's their first choice of a line of work. So when we think about economic self-empowerment, we could consider projects like we see here and supporting those, but we could also think more creatively of what would advocacy toward helping out the workers who are caught in the CAFO and the slaughterhouse system, helping them transition to other lines of work. What would that look like? What form might that take? And then we can extend this idea, the idea of economic self-empowerment, to think about earth self-empowerment. So projects like the Vegan Land Movement and Sadhana Forests that are focused on taking land away from animal agriculture or taking degraded land and reforesting it through veganic means. So another thing the khadi movement excelled at, and we do have some examples of this in the vegan movement as well, is to look at not just why to move in a plant-forward direction, but how. So things like vegan cooking classes, and some examples are Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine Food for Life project, the Forks Over Knives vegan chef course, PCRM's Hospital Chef Challenge. And then also importantly, focusing on veganic farming and vegan permaculture. We've all heard this argument of, well, the world can't go vegan because we need the manure to grow the plants. And veganic permaculture and vegan organics or stock-free growing is a wonderful rejoinder to that, to demonstrate that in fact, no, we can have agriculture, we can have gardening where we're growing plants with inputs that come from other plants and not from animals. Or as the Vegan Organic Network says, that veganic growing is not free of animals, but it's where all animals are free. We already have examples of working in coalition and welcoming the excluded, largely through vegan food aid and through vegan social justice efforts. So Go Dharmic's food provisioning, Climate Healers, Chili's on Wheels, and the Vegan Food Bank in downtown LA. There are many examples of this, as well as, of course, food empowerment projects work with migrant laborers and their school supply drive, Brave New Life's project, which provides employment opportunities for those looking to segue out of working in slaughterhouses and other forms of animal exploitation. So overall, the khadi movement shows us that we can celebrate the humble and the simple, and that the solution to a massive political problem, to large-scale exploitation, can actually build the new out of the pre-existing. We can actually celebrate what has been stigmatized or rejected because it's simple. So a quote from the musician Moby is, there's nothing as incredible as the humble bean. It removes carbon from the atmosphere. It's a food, and it's a seed that can grow more of itself, as well as being full of nutrients like antioxidants, minerals, vitamins, and yes, even the much talked about protein. Or as a food critic talking about Rancho Gordo's beans said, when there's all this talk about how to feed the world and whether we should be factory farming crickets, when you make a pot of beans, a pot of heirloom beans, and it tastes so wonderful, you have to wonder what the fuss is about. So the khadi movement shows us what the mainstream environmental movement is just starting to realize, that individual and systemic changes are not at odds. Individual actions create the conditions for social change. So there is power in social contagion, and vice versa, that individual actions make us more receptive to social change when social change comes from the top down. So we know that changing our way of life is necessary to avoid the worst effects of the climate crisis, as well as to mitigate against the damage that's being done to animals and frontline communities. And when we undertake voluntary action, it acknowledges this, and it signals that actually changing our life could be a positive thing. So my conclusion is really turning it over to you for questions. So applying the khadi movement as a model concept, what ideas does this generate for the movement for earth and animal liberation? And I'd like to turn it over to you for discussion. In lieu of maybe taking questions, although I'm happy to take questions too, I want to suggest to you that we can consider some of these questions that I'm putting forward. So for instance, Maurice Mitchell, who has founded the Working Families Party, which is an effort to build a cross-class, cross-racial progressive movement. He speaks about this effort as, he puts it forward this question: how do we make this irresistible? And I think that's a question that we can think about as well, about the movement for earth and animal liberation. The khadi movement, Gandhi and the other Indian nationalists, they made the khadi movement irresistible. So to think this through, I have some questions. And this is about the kind of initiatives that are already happening and also what we would like to see happening. So how specifically can we identify particular political and economic demands and make them more apparent and direct them at the right institutions? How do we signal consistently that veganism is not just a lifestyle choice? How do we intentionally create the wide bridges that Damon Santola has talked about without turning veganism into an exclusive club? What are ideas for creating economic self-empowerment through veganism? And then how can we amplify the work that's being done in marginalized and excluded communities as part of self-empowerment and as moving towards earth and animal liberation? So, having put forward those questions to you, we have time for discussion. And they are big questions, indeed. They are, yes, if we could answer these questions in a 1-hour webinar, we would be all set and on our way. So it's just a starting point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jay. This was very enlightening and also inspiring. So really appreciate you giving us these questions and directing us towards looking at veganism as a social justice movement. Wanted to also mention, it's interesting you were talking about transitioning from the slaughterhouses, and we at In Defense of Animals, we have a animal activist support line that people can contact to reach out for support. And we also have one of those lines set up for slaughterhouse workers. We set this up several years ago. And so people who were involved in that line of work could reach out for help. And we have a whole resource page with all kinds of programs that they can access to help them if they wanted to find a new vocation. So there are resources out there, and we have one too. And it's excellent to be able to see how those connect with the social justice movement that you're talking about.
That's so interesting. And do you have information on like how many people it's served?
Yes, I mean, we didn't have a lot of people who contacted us. That was the missing link for us. I do think it's a innovative idea, and that as we move closer and closer and more advocacy is done, and I think there will be more demand for it. But at the time, it was a little ahead of its time, actually. So we didn't get too many calls. We have gotten calls through our support line occasionally of somebody who's part of the slaughterhouse worker crew, and occasionally we'll call. But I'd like to see more and more of that.
Yeah, I think that would be the next step of figuring out how to get the information to the slaughterhouse workers to let them know that these resources are out there.
Yes, yes, definitely. And I think we also partnered with Toronto Pig Safe on that. So a group that was working directly with some of the slaughterhouse workers and was interfacing with them regularly. So
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I'm sure we have some interesting questions. I want to thank everybody for putting them into the chat. One of them here is that there are so many environmentalists who eat meat, and they know the damage by the CAFOs. How can we reach these people? And this is from Rebecca.
Ooh, that's a big question. And I guess the short answer to it is if I knew the answer, I would have already done it. I suspect that the argument that individual choices are not going to save the world is a little bit of a defensive one. So I think part of the reason why we hear this from mainstream environmentalists and mainstream environmental organizations is because people don't want to change their own habits. And that's a convenient justification to say, oh, well, my choices are so small, we really need system change. Which doesn't fully answer your question, because your question's a very difficult one. I suspect that part of the conversation needs to be around this idea of, okay, yes, individual choices aren't going to change the world, but systemic change or top-down change without individual change is just going to be met with resentment, right? So we have to do both. And then I think another way of approaching that, like if you're talking to somebody individually and they're saying, well, they're an environmental activist, but then they're ordering like a cheeseburger, is perhaps to pursue a line of like the Socratic method, kind of like, oh, okay, you're an environmentalist and you eat meat, but do you ride a bike instead of driving? Do you take public transit instead of driving, right? You know, but you think individual choices can't save the world. Okay, that's fine. But would you drive an SUV if you didn't have to? Right. And so maybe that line of questioning, so that one person, so a person can like come to their own conclusion, sort of, you know, in a guided sort of way.
Yeah, thank you. I know that that is a tough question. You're right. That's a toughie. And I think that you did a good job of providing some options.
But I
Um,
think it's also like it's a tough question, but it's also one that it's important to ruminate on, because it's like, it's not just like, oh, it's tough, it's unsolvable. It's actually like, this is something we really need to figure out how to push the needle on this one.
oh, yeah. Also, the environmentalists, they really are our allies and what you might consider low-hanging fruit of the veganism, advocacy world, because these are people who care about the impact of their choices, and also because they are learning a lot about the impact of climate change and the climate crisis on the planet. And animal agriculture is one of the leading negative impacts on that. Um, so there's another question too, and this is more related to what you specifically talked about. What is the pivotal point, or what was, in the khadi movement that spurred people to start wearing these more, cultural
Right, right.
based?
What was the tipping point? I think there were a couple of tipping points. I think one of them was the Great Salt March. So, in addition to wearing homespun cotton and trying to take the economic power away from the British Empire that way, there was also a move against buying British factory-made salt. And so Gandhi organized large numbers of people to walk from somewhere in central Gujarat to the sea, and to actually go and dry out the salt water and sort of harvest the salt themselves. And I think that was a real turning point. My understanding is that was a real turning point in the Indian nationalist movement and in the popularity of this model of economic self-empowerment. And so it would be useful. I think the thing that's really interesting there is that it's like not just, so the masses were organized. Yes, exactly. So it was about mobilizing a mass movement, and it was about combining individual action and protest, because the Salt March was a couple of things. One, it was like it was literally taking this product that they weren't going to buy from the British anymore. And so it was on that level. And then also at the same time, it was a pilgrimage. It was thousands of people walking to the sea. And it was creative in a way, in its structure, right? So it wasn't just people standing there with signs being like, we won't buy your salt. It was actually people like sort of performing this physical effort, and walking through villages, walking through the countryside, and is stimulating interest as they went along. So I think it's like this combination of voluntary action, protest, economic intervention, and then like these creative kinds of solutions. And I think it goes back to that Maurice Mitchell idea, like it became irresistible through that combination of factors.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for pointing out the importance of the creativity in the advocacy and bringing it back to the people in a lot of ways, like walking through the villages. That's very key. And this question, actually, there's another one here that reminds me of this a bit. Um, Diane says she's wondering about with the immigration issues happening in the United States and the likely shortage of ag workers and possible rising produce prices. If there's an opportunity to get people interested in doing more of their own food growing with home gardens, kind of like the victory gardens that were people were encouraged to do in World War II and also through World War I and II, excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an organization here in California called Victory Gardens for Peace. And the idea is to like revisit the Victory Gardens for environmental reasons largely, but also like just, in terms of food security, and recognizing that there are a number of factors that influence food security. Certainly the kind of, the horrible rhetoric and it's looking like action against the undocumented workers on who our food system rests could affect food security. That was actually an issue with Brexit as well, that people voted for Brexit without thinking about the fact that so much of their food was coming from mainland Europe. So foods growing produce for food security does seem to make a lot of sense. And also, I think there is something that's so elemental about growing food. I mean, I live in an apartment. I can't really grow much in the way of food, but even the little bit, the few herbs I have growing on my counter here, it's like there's something so elemental about it. That kind of, I think, in a tangible way reminds us that like people can get tangled up in these ridiculous kinds of arguments of like, oh, well, eating meat is natural because people at a certain point in history did it. So factory farming is not that different. And plants have feelings and oh, growing plants for food does just as much environmental damage. And there's like a lot of like these spurious arguments. But like when you actually just like plant some seeds in the ground and you see something grow out of it and then you eat it, it's like it really just like restores the sense of like, oh yeah, this is something very basic. This is something humble and small. But experientially, it's so generative and it's so empowering. And so I think that can really kind of function as part of this multi-part, like this multi-part process that I'm putting forward that's like the model that we need for animal freedom.
Well, we do have in the chat box here some discussion going on about having a massive sort of protest or a movement. I don't know if there's anything that you can envision or um, that any kind of way that we can bring this into the forefront. And one of the people in the chat was saying, well, would the media cover it if we did have one of these? I know there was a kind of a pivotal time in the 80s where we did have a very large march. And I know people who participated in it, and they really look back at that as like a special time in our history of animal rights. And is there something that we could do to bring that back? Do you think that we have the pieces in play that we could leverage?
Yeah, I think what's so difficult about advocating for animals is one, well, there's two things that I think are particularly difficult. One is that we are a movement of allies, right? And that's always going to look less credible in a sense, like because we're speaking for somebody else. And rightly so, a lot of our advocacy now is focused on like let the people who are affected do the representing. And we can't do that with animals. But then the other thing is because animals are trivialized, therefore advocating on their behalf becomes trivialized. Therefore, one doesn't need to take seriously any kind of advocacy on their behalf. And so that's like a vicious cycle. So I wonder about creative solutions. The the research project I'm working on now is about social justice, but it's not about symbolic protest. So it's not about like marches where people are carrying signs, but rather it's about things that I'm calling reflexive activism, where people protest unjust conditions while living out their alternative. Um, and so when it comes to the animal example, like it's thinking about things like Animal Save as an example of like a grief effort, but also things like animal sanctuaries as a form of imagination. And places like Vine Sanctuary or Piedmont Animal Refuge, where it's actually about like redesigning spaces so that they're more conducive to how animals want to be living. Um, and so none of those, to my mind, are exactly the solution that we're looking for here. But I wonder if there is something more creative, structurally creative. Like it's not to say that marches can't be creative, but like something that's structurally more creative, something like Veg Fest, but perhaps a little less commercial, or something that's focused on community building, something that's like focused on bringing people together to have this sense of like you're not alone in caring about animals. And we already have a lot of resources for that, of course, but like what are ways in which we could be more creative about that? Like going back to that idea of the salt march going through the villages and people seeing this sort of this procession going past and saying, oh, this is incredible. People are talking about doing what could never have been done or what we thought couldn't have been done. So I guess that I don't have an answer. I just have more questions. And the questions sort of hinge on like, how can we use all the creativity that's in this movement to think about ways of really building a mass movement and getting around those questions of animals being trivialized?
Yeah, I think a bit about your examples, and there are things going on now that maybe even on the fringes of our vegan movement, there are people who are living out their lives in a way, in a van or kind of having a nomadic lifestyle. There are vegan groups of these folks who are doing this, and they had a kind of like a gathering in January. I think they're going to be doing this every year, but just to support that lifestyle. And that reminds me of what you're talking about, kind of creative way to live your life differently. And that's the action. It may not be a march, but it could be a caravan of people who are vegan who choose to live off the grid. These are just some different examples of things that are happening, and maybe we're not recognizing them as political actions, but actually they are.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Yeah. And likewise, I mean, even something as humble as a community garden, right? That sort of idea of like, okay, let's come together and let's work the soil and let's, grow food that we can share with each other, building a kind of mutual aid network, might be another way of approaching this kind of making this irresistible.
Oh, definitely. And that is something I know very well. I was a mosaic muralist and did a lot of these murals in community gardens, especially on the East Coast. So it is a way of bringing people together, and a lot of it is over food because you're growing these amazing this bounty of food that can be prepared in a vegan way. So that's lovely to kind of work within the existing system that we have of community gardens. That's excellent.
Um,
So
sorry, I wanted to chime in on one particular topic that you mentioned, Jay, that I really liked, which was, thank you, Lisa, which was the concept of bringing veganism forward as a intentional boycott of an unjust system. I feel like that's such a great phrase to bring to if someone is like, oh, why are you vegan? What are you doing? You know, a lot of times it's really hard to say, especially when it's like family, because you end up accidentally insulting them for eating meat. And this way it feels more empowering. It feels more like, well, it's a boycott, it's an intentional boycott of an unjust system. And that makes them feel more like, oh, you know, I imagine them going like, oh, that's actually really cool because everybody loves a good rebellion. So, um, where this is, I mean, for people in the United States, where our whole thing is rebellion, we love it. So, um, I feel like that would really do a great job in like bringing people to your side and getting them to really get more interested instead of being turned off by you saying something that makes them feel attacked for eating meat. You know, like I'm doing this for ethical reasons. And that makes them feel like they're not ethical. Instead, it's a rebellion that they can join,
Mm.
which we love. So
Yeah,
I just like that a lot.
yeah. And I'm sure I've heard other people say this, so I don't want to claim credit for the phrase, but I really like that idea of saying this is an
Mm,
intentional boycott of an unjust system because it kind of assumes agreement, and sometimes that can be a good tactic. Like I in my one of my other hats is I'm an empowerment self-defense instructor, and sometimes with like verbal self-defense strategies, one thing that one can try is to like assume agreement on the part of the other person, like, you know, oh no, I know you mean really well, right?
mm,
Um, and I think that that idea of like it's a boycott of an unjust system is like kind of almost saying like, well, we all agree that it's unjust.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
how I intend to deal with it, you know.
yeah,
So in the chat, like maybe even adding the word violent, unjust, a boycott of a violent system, right? And just sort of that way, maybe potentially it's not a surefire tactic, but it can sort of invite an agreement, like, oh, that's right, yeah, I guess it is sort of an exploited, and we all agree factory farming is bad, and
yeah. Because
yeah,
we've all seen those photos that are so horrible, and the people who are practicing cognitive dissonance are trying to forget them, but they
right,
have seen them, but they're trying to forget. I saw a really great comment from Stephanie here about doing focus groups to see different words and see how they're perceived by different people. The word unjust, the word violent, the word unethical. I'm sure there's a bunch more great words we could use and see which words work best so we can figure out what is the best way to respond when people ask you those kinds of questions and when you're with family and friends and they want to learn more or something, or they think you're weird and stuff like that. So I like
yes,
that a
focus
lot.
groups is really interesting, and also I guess maybe in relation to this question of making how do we build a mass movement? There's been really interesting research on deep canvassing, and like that idea of like where people really sit, the person who's doing the canvassing sits and listens and talks to individuals to really like try to find points of agreement. And it's actually been shown to be pretty effective with advocating for animal rights and for veganism, because there's a core principle here that like we all agree on. You know, we all agree that like animals matter, basically, even though people sometimes will say that they don't.
Yeah.
Um, and so then it becomes just a question of method, right? I think, and that's where I guess the boycott thing comes in as well. Of like, oh,
Yeah.
this is just a question of method. This is how I'm approaching it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that my dog is barking so much.
Okay.
They just decided to start playing, and the little one
That's what they do.
is.
That is okay. And we know it's actually coming to the end of
Oh,
our discussion today.
we are.
And so wanted to um, take a moment and just acknowledge there's some conversation in the chat as well about the growing numbers of Black vegans in the community as well. And that is a huge benefit to our movement today. And I think we can thank people like Tracy McQuarter, who is with By Any Greens Necessary and hosted a campaign to inspire 10,000 Black women to go vegan. And so we're just in a wonderful time of growth as well. And especially good timing because we have Black History Month going on this month.
Yeah.
So,
And Black
yeah.
veganism has done a really good job of making those connections between the exploitation of animals, the exploitation of humans, and the destruction of the environment. And they've been Black vegan theorists have done a brilliant job of showing how all of those oppressive systems are built upon each other, and they reinforce each other.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay, for kind of putting it all together for us. I think we really appreciate how you've woven the theme today through all the questions and also through your answers. And just want to take a moment to really thank everyone for joining us. We've really had a great opportunity of learning and discussion, and I'm sure there's more in the chat box, but we are close to our time, and just want to have gratitude to all of you for joining us for Activist Appreciation Month and for this Fireside Chat. This is our last one for the month, so we're really looking forward to this, and I'm happy that all of you could join us. Just wanted to see, Jay, did you have anything that you wanted to say as we close today?
Just to say thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me, and thank you, Mary, for handling all the text. And thank you, everybody, for your brilliant questions and comments, and for thinking this through with me in such a thoughtful kind of way.
Yes, such a blessing to have this opportunity to share together today. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us. There will be a recording and we will post it up on YouTube. And if you registered, you will get the link right in your inbox. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day and enjoy Activist Appreciation Month. If you want to find our resources, they are at idausa.org/activist month. And we've got all of the replays there, plus lots of links to support your activism. So we hope you'll take a peek at that sometime. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.